Imagine you are sitting in a room with the man who played Tom Hagen in The Godfather, who surfed the waves of war in Apocalypse Now, who won an Oscar for Tender Mercies, and who stared down some of the most powerful people in Hollywood history without blinking once. Now imagine that man, in the final years of his life, leaning forward and deciding that he had absolutely nothing left to lose, and everything left to say. That man is Robert Duvall. And what he said about Hollywood is not just a critique. It is a confession. It is a warning. And for those paying attention, it is the most honest thing anyone in that industry has said in decades. Stay with me, because this story does not start with red carpets and Oscar speeches. It starts in a tiny apartment in New York City where three young men shared a single dream and almost nothing else. The year was 1955. Three broke, hungry, desperate young actors were crammed into a small apartment in New York City, sharing meals, sharing disappointments, and sharing a vision of what they could become. Their names were Robert Duvall, Gene Hackman, and Dustin Hoffman. Three names that would one day light up marquees across the world. But in that cold apartment, none of them were famous. None of them were celebrated. None of them were even close to getting a real acting job. Robert Duvall was the quiet one. The one who observed everything. The one who didn't talk much, but when he did, every single word carried the weight of something real. Gene Hackman was restless and intense. Dustin Hoffman was scrappy and unpredictable. Together, they formed a brotherhood born out of poverty and passion. And it was in that apartment, long before Hollywood ever opened its golden gates to them, that Duvall began to understand something crucial about the industry that would eventually consume all three of them. He understood that Hollywood was not a dream factory. It was a machinery of control. And the moment you stopped being useful to the machine would throw you away without a second thought. Robert Duvall did not arrive in Hollywood through the front door. He worked for it. He scratched for it. He studied at the neighborhood Playhouse School of the Theater in New York under the legendary Sanford Meisner, who taught him something that Duvall never forgot. The truth of a moment is the only thing worth performing. Not glamour. Not spectacle. Not costume. Truth. And that truth, that raw, unvarnished commitment to authentic human behavior on screen, is what made Duvall one of the greatest actors who ever lived. But it is also what made him one of Hollywood's most uncomfortable truths. Because Hollywood, as it evolved over the decades, stopped wanting truth. It started wanting product. It started wanting safety. It started wanting formulas and franchises and focus-grouped emotions. And Duvall watched all of it happen in real time, from the inside, with his eyes wide open and his mouth, for the most part, tightly shut. Until it couldn't stay shut anymore. When Francis Ford Coppola cast Robert Duvall as Tom Hagen in The Godfather in 1972, it was the role that changed everything. Duvall didn't play Tom Hagen like a movie character. He played him like a real man. A quiet, calculating, deeply loyal man who operated in the shadows of power and never once needed to raise his voice to make the entire room shake. The performance was so precise, so human, so deeply unsettling in its calmness that audiences leaned forward in their seats every time he appeared on screen. He wasn't the lead. He wasn't even close to the center of the story. But he was the gravity. He was the force that held the entire Corleone world together. And yet, when it came time for The Godfather Part II, Duvall made a decision that shocked Hollywood to its core. He walked away. He turned down the sequel because the money wasn't right, not because he didn't believe in the project, but because he believed that his work had value and that the studio needed to respect that value. It was a message that Hollywood heard loud and clear, and they never quite forgave him for sending it. The relationship between Robert Duvall and the Hollywood machine was always complicated. He was too talented to ignore, but too independent to fully control. He did things on his own terms. He chose roles that challenged him rather than roles that were safe. He invested in smaller projects, in independent films, in stories that told the truth about America. He made The Apostle in 1997, a film he wrote, produced, directed, and starred in, a deeply personal exploration of faith, redemption, and contradiction. He funded much of it himself. Hollywood didn't quite know what to do with it. They could not categorize it. They could not market it easily. It didn't fit into any of their boxes. And that's exactly why it was brilliant. But Hollywood has never liked things it cannot put in a box. That was one of the first cracks in Duvall's relationship with the modern industry, and over the following years, that crack would widen into something vast and irreparable. What Duvall began to witness in Hollywood in the 1990s and into the 2000s was a slow and deliberate dismantling of everything that had made the industry great. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and methodical, like a termite infestation inside a beautiful old mansion. The walls looked fine from the outside. The paint was still fresh. The chandeliers still sparkled. But inside, the wood was being eaten away, beam by beam, until the entire structure became hollow. Duvall saw it. He felt it. And his frustration grew with every passing year. The studios were no longer interested in building careers. They were interested in building brands. Actors were no longer artists. They were intellectual properties. Stories were no longer told to move people. They were told to sell merchandise, launch cinematic universes, and feed an insatiable global appetite for sequels and prequels and reboots that strip-mined every ounce of originality from a culture that had once produced some of the most important films in human history. Robert Duvall was not a man who minced words. On the record, in interviews and roundtable discussions over the years, he made his feelings known in ways that were impossible to misunderstand. He talked about Stanley Kubrick, one of the most revered directors in cinema history, and he called him, without hesitation, an actor's enemy. He pointed directly at The Shining and A Clockwork Orange and said those films contained some of the worst performances he had ever seen in cinema. Not because the actors lacked talent. Jack Nicholson and Malcolm McDowell were extraordinary performers, but because Kubrick's obsessive method of forcing actors through dozens upon dozens of identical takes had drained them of the very thing that made performance valuable: spontaneity, instinct, and the truth of the moment. Now, you can agree or disagree with Duvall's assessment. But what you cannot deny is the courage it took to say it. In Hollywood, Kubrick is a sacred cow. Criticizing his work is considered professional suicide. Duvall didn't care. He said what he believed. And that willingness to say unpopular truths was both his greatest strength and, in the eyes of Hollywood's power structure, his most dangerous quality. There was another director Duvall clashed with throughout his career, and that clash speaks to something much deeper than a simple personality conflict. Duvall had an almost allergic reaction to directors who tried to micromanage actors. He believed, with an intensity that bordered on religious conviction, that the director's job was to create the conditions for truth to emerge, and then get out of the way. "Get out of my way" was a phrase he reportedly used with more than one filmmaker over the course of his career. Not out of arrogance. Out of principle. He had studied at the feet of Sanford Meisner. He understood human behavior in ways that most people, including most directors, never would. When a director tried to explain to him how to feel a scene that he had already lived in his bones, it was not just an affront to his ego. It was, to him, an insult to the craft itself. And the craft, to Robert Duvall, was sacred. But here is where the story gets bigger. Here is where Robert Duvall's personal frustrations connect to something that millions of people are feeling right now about Hollywood as a whole. Because what Duvall was describing, the death of truth in performance, the domination of control over creativity, the replacement of human authenticity with manufactured spectacle, is not just the story of one man's career. It is the story of Hollywood's suicide. And the numbers prove it. In 2025, Hollywood's box office plunged to a 27-year low. Think about that number for a moment. 27 years. The last time Hollywood performed this poorly at the box office was in the late 1990s, before the era of digital technology, before streaming, before the internet transformed the way humans consume entertainment. And yet, with all the tools of the modern age at their disposal, with all the data and analytics and artificial intelligence and global marketing budgets that would have seemed like science fiction to the filmmakers of the Golden Age, Hollywood still managed to produce results that would make even the most optimistic studio executive stare at the ceiling at 3 a.m. and wonder what went wrong. What went wrong is exactly what Robert Duvall warned about. Hollywood stopped trusting its audience. It started treating audiences like consumers rather than human beings. It started making content, and that word, content, is itself a symptom of the disease that was designed to be inoffensive to every demographic in every global market simultaneously. The result was films and television shows that said nothing, meant nothing, and left audiences feeling nothing. And audiences responded in the most eloquent way possible. They stayed home. They cancelled their streaming subscriptions. They stopped buying tickets. Not because they stopped loving movies, but because the movies stopped loving them back. Robert Duvall's quote from IMDb says it all: "The way Hollywood speaks out is absolutely beyond me. Some people are so ill-informed. I mean, why be so outspoken about it anyway?" He was not just talking about politics. He was talking about the culture of performance that had infected the entire industry. The culture where every actor, every director, every studio executive needed to perform their values publicly, loudly, and constantly. Where the substance of the work mattered less than the optics of the performer. Where a film's press tour became more important than the film itself. Where the act of making art had been replaced by the act of marketing a brand. Duvall found this not just intellectually bankrupt but morally repugnant. He had spent 60 years learning his craft, honing his instrument, committing himself to the truth of human experience on screen. And he watched his industry abandon all of that for a chance to trend on social media. Let's talk about the specific names because this story has faces and names attached to it. Gene Hackman, one of the greatest actors of the 20th century, the man who shared that tiny New York apartment with Duvall and Hoffman, ended up so disgusted with Hollywood that he retired from acting entirely and moved to New Mexico to raise horses and write novels. Hackman, who won 2 Academy Awards and gave performances in films like The French Connection, Unforgiven, and The Royal Tenenbaums that are among the finest in cinematic history, simply walked away. He didn't do press tours explaining his decision. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't post on Instagram about his journey. He just left. And in leaving, he communicated something more powerful than any interview ever could. He communicated that Hollywood had become a place that a truly great artist could no longer call home. Dustin Hoffman, the third member of that original trio, went a different route. He stayed in the industry, continued to work, but his career too became a story of a man at war with a machine that wanted to use him without truly understanding him. Hoffman, who delivered one of the most committed and discussed performances in cinema history in Rain Man alongside Tom Cruise, who transformed himself completely for Tootsie, who showed in The Graduate that a camera placed in front of a genuine human being having a genuine human experience is the most powerful thing in all of art. Even Hoffman eventually became a symbol of Hollywood's complicated relationship with its own legends. The industry that had once celebrated these men eventually found them inconvenient. Too demanding. Too real. Too unwilling to become what the marketing department needed them to be. And then there was the conversation nobody in Hollywood wanted to have, but which Robert Duvall forced everyone to at least acknowledge. The conversation about what happens to storytelling when you remove the human being at its center. When you replace the flawed, messy, beautiful, contradictory truth of human experience with a calculated, market-tested, demographically optimized simulation of human experience. Duvall understood, in his marrow, that the greatest films ever made were not great because of their budgets or their special effects or their marketing campaigns. They were great because they told the truth. They told the truth about violence and love and betrayal and redemption and what it means to be alive in this specific, brief, terrifying, wonderful moment in time. The Godfather was great because it told the truth about family and power and the American dream corrupted. Apocalypse Now was great because it told the truth about war and madness and the darkness inside the human heart. Tender Mercies was great because it told the truth about one broken man's quiet attempt to find grace in a world that had given him no reason to keep looking. Where are those films now? Where is that tradition of American filmmaking that believed a quiet scene between 2 people in a small room could shake the world? It has been replaced by spectacle. By explosions and CGI landscapes and superhero universes that sprawl across dozens of films and television shows, each one designed to make you feel like you've experienced something while making sure you've actually felt nothing. The Marvel machine, the DC machine, the Star Wars machine. These are not films in the way that Duvall and Hackman and Hoffman understood films. They are delivery mechanisms for intellectual property. They are roller coasters with dialogue. They are exercises in brand management wearing the clothes of storytelling. And audiences are beginning to understand that. They are beginning to feel the difference between being moved and being stimulated. And they are choosing with their wallets, by staying away in numbers that Hollywood has never seen before. Robert Duvall lived long enough. He passed away on February 16, 2026, at the age of 95, to see the industry he devoted his life to reach this crisis point. He lived long enough to watch the Hollywood sign, which had once been the symbol of the world's most powerful dream factory, become the symbol of an industry in denial. He lived long enough to watch streaming platforms tear apart the theatrical experience that had once been the communal heart of American culture. He lived long enough to see actors replaced by algorithms, stories replaced by franchises, and the courage of truthful art replaced by the cowardice of consensus content. And in his final years, he made no secret of what he thought about all of it. He had always spoken his mind, even when it cost him. Even when the people he was criticizing were powerful enough to make his phone stop ringing. He had called out directors. He had called out co-stars. He had called out studios. And in the end, he called out the entire system. Not with anger. With something much more devastating. With disappointment. Because here is what you have to understand about Robert Duvall's critique of Hollywood. It did not come from bitterness. It did not come from the frustration of a man who felt overlooked or undervalued. Duvall won the Oscar. He had the legacy. He had the respect of every serious filmmaker and serious actor who had ever worked with him. His critique came from love. From the love of a craftsman watching his craft being desecrated. It came from the grief of a man who had given everything to an art form that was now being monetized, franchised, and optimized out of existence. When Duvall spoke about Hollywood falling apart, he was not just describing a business in decline. He was describing the death of something sacred. Something that had the power to change people's lives. Something that, at its best, could make you feel less alone in the universe. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, is that Hollywood had this incredible power, the power to connect human beings across every cultural and linguistic and national divide through the universal language of shared human experience, and it chose to use that power to sell toys. The people inside Hollywood who understood this, the directors, the writers, the actors who still believed in the old tradition, became increasingly marginalized as the years went on. Names like Paul Thomas Anderson and Alfonso Cuarón and Barry Jenkins continued to make films of extraordinary power and beauty. But they operated at the margins of the commercial system, dependent on independent financing and prestige platforms and Oscar campaigns to find their audiences. The center of the commercial industry moved further and further away from what Duvall and his generation had understood as serious filmmaking. And the gap between prestige cinema and commercial cinema grew so wide that the two barely seemed to be operating in the same cultural universe anymore. And here is something that nobody in the mainstream film industry wanted to say out loud, but which Robert Duvall's legacy forces us to confront. The decline of Hollywood is not just about woke politics or streaming platforms or COVID-19 shutting down theaters. Those are symptoms. The disease is deeper. The disease is the abandonment of the belief that great art requires great courage. That you cannot make a film that truly matters if you are too afraid to tell a truth that will make some people uncomfortable. Every film that changed the world, and The Godfather changed the world, Apocalypse Now changed the world, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest changed the world, every single one of those films made powerful people extremely uncomfortable. They forced audiences to look at things they would rather not look at. They refused to provide easy comfort. They demanded engagement, attention, thought. They trusted the audience to be intelligent enough to handle complexity. And audiences, given that trust, rose to meet it. They showed up. They watched. They talked. They were changed. Modern Hollywood does not trust its audience. It fears its audience. It fears that if it says the wrong thing, if it includes the wrong character, if it tells a story from the wrong perspective, the internet will rise up and destroy it. And in that fear, it has made itself impotent. It has produced film after film and show after show that is so carefully constructed to offend nobody that it ends up meaning nothing to everyone. The kind of art that Robert Duvall dedicated his life to making, art that grabbed you by the collar and refused to let go, has been replaced by content that you consume and forget before you've even finished watching it. Now consider the directors that Duvall named before his death as the 5 directors he considered the worst to work with. This list reveals not just personal grievances but a deeper philosophical disagreement about what filmmaking is for. Duvall's problem was never with directors who had strong visions. He admired strong visions. His problem was with directors who had strong egos but no deep connection to the truth of human experience. Directors who used actors as props in their visual spectacle rather than as the living, breathing, feeling center of the story. Directors who cared more about how a shot looked than what it meant. Directors who prioritized aesthetics over authenticity. In Duvall's worldview, informed by decades of Meisner training and a lifetime of serious study of human behavior, this was not just bad filmmaking. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what cinema is. Let's go deeper into the moment that crystallized everything for a generation of Hollywood insiders. When Duvall turned down The Godfather Part II because the money wasn't right, it wasn't just a negotiation tactic. It was a statement of principle. He was saying, I am an artist, not a product. My work has value. The studio does not own me. And the studio, Paramount Pictures, one of the most powerful entertainment companies in the world at the time, was forced to remake the character of Tom Hagen into an entirely different kind of role, one that explained Hagen's absence rather than featuring his presence. Duvall's absence from that film was, in a strange way, more powerful than his presence could have been. It was a reminder that the machine needed the artists more than the artists needed the machine. It was a lesson that Hollywood seemed unable to learn, even decades after it was taught. Now let's talk about what this means for the industry today. In 2025, Hollywood's box office fell to levels not seen since the late 1990s. Streaming services that had promised to democratize entertainment were quietly canceling shows and laying off creative teams. The Great Streaming War, which had promised viewers infinite choice and original content in abundance, had ended in a series of corporate consolidations that left the landscape looking remarkably similar to the old studio system, except with less courage and less creativity and more surveillance of viewing habits to determine what audiences would accept rather than what they needed to see. The algorithms that determined what got made were, by definition, backward-looking. They could only recommend what had already worked. They could never predict what would work next. They could never identify the next Godfather, because The Godfather was exactly the kind of film that nobody's algorithm would have greenlit. A slow, complex, morally ambiguous story about a crime family that you end up loving despite everything you know about them. No algorithm would say yes to that. Only a human being with courage and taste and a belief in the intelligence of the audience could say yes to that. The actors who came after Duvall's generation, the generation of Hackman and Hoffman and Jack Nicholson and Al Pacino, have had their own complex relationships with Hollywood's evolution. Some, like Nicholson, simply withdrew from the industry rather than compromise. Others, like Pacino, continued to work but seemed increasingly disconnected from the kind of material that had made them legendary. The question of what happens to great talent when the industry stops producing great material is one that nobody in Hollywood was asking publicly. But Duvall was asking it. He was asking it in interviews. He was asking it in the choices he made about what to film and what to decline. He was asking it in the fierceness of his commitment to his craft even in his final years, when he was still taking on roles in films like The Pale Blue Eye because the material was challenging and the truth it demanded from him was real. It is also worth talking about the women in this story, because Hollywood's treatment of female actors is another dimension of its larger failure that Duvall understood intuitively. The industry that had produced Meryl Streep and Faye Dunaway and Ellen Burstyn and Diane Keaton, women who had worked with Duvall, who had matched him scene for scene in some of the most powerful films of the 20th century, had evolved into an industry that seemed unable to build careers around women with the same patience and depth that it had once invested in its male stars. It cycled through female talent with extraordinary speed, celebrating and then discarding actresses before they had the chance to build the kind of deep, complex, career-long legacy that Duvall himself had built. It was another symptom of the same disease. The inability to invest in depth, in complexity, in the long-term accumulation of craft and wisdom that turns a performer into an artist. Faye Dunaway, who starred alongside Duvall in films that defined American cinema, found herself increasingly pushed to the margins of the industry as she aged. Meryl Streep, arguably the most technically skilled actress in Hollywood history, continued to work but operated largely in a prestige sphere separate from the commercial center. Ellen Burstyn, who had given one of the most devastating performances in the history of cinema in Requiem for a Dream, was never fully recognized by the industry the way her male counterparts were. And Diane Keaton, who matched Al Pacino's Michael Corleone with a performance of quiet devastation in The Godfather, found her career defined more by her personal style than by the depth of her artistry as she grew older. These women were part of the same golden tradition as Duvall. And Hollywood's failure to honor that tradition fully was another piece of the puzzle that Duvall understood and mourned. Robert Duvall's final public statements were not angry. They were resigned. They were the statements of a man who had fought his battles, won some and lost some, and had arrived at a place of clear-eyed honesty about the world he was leaving behind. He spoke about authenticity, about the responsibility of the artist to tell the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable, about the danger of an entertainment industry that had become so focused on what it could monetize that it had forgotten what it existed to create. He spoke about the young actors he saw coming up in the industry, talented, committed, serious young men and women who were being handed material that was unworthy of their talent, unworthy of their commitment, unworthy of the tradition they were entering. And he spoke about his hope, a quiet, stubborn, deeply American hope, that the pendulum would swing back. That audiences, denied the real thing for long enough, would eventually demand it again. That the industry, faced with its own commercial collapse, would eventually be forced to rediscover the thing that had made it worth building in the first place. Because the truth is that nobody actually wants bad movies. Nobody wakes up in the morning hoping to spend 2 hours watching something that doesn't challenge them, doesn't move them, doesn't make them feel more alive than they did before they sat down. The appetite for great art is bottomless. It is one of the deepest and most consistent human hungers. What Hollywood has been doing for the past 2 decades is not giving people what they want. It has been giving people what it thinks it can safely sell. And those are 2 entirely different things.